Hi everyone. So this is your CPT for this week, and we'll start with a retrieval. And I thought this would be a good challenge for you. So some of the names that I've mentioned certainly, and others. Andy's mentioned a couple of these. We've engaged with a number of these different key people. So I just want you to see if you can remember what ideas are associated with them, basically what they said, what they've done, any key ideas, theories that we have associated with each of them. So if you're feeling like a challenge, that might be something that you could have a go at and see just how much of it all you've taken into your long-term memory. So pause this and have a go. Okay, so hopefully you did, and you'll probably want to check your answers without having to wade through absolutely loads of different things. So there's your answers on the screen there. I would imagine some of them were a bit challenging. I'm not sure whether you would have known that Pavio was the original dual coding. You might have come across it if you've read widely, but obviously we've talked more recently, and I've used lots of examples from Caviglioli because he's kind of interpreted that original idea of dual coding for the context of teachers and in the classroom. So that's probably a name that was more familiar to you than Pavio, but he was the original who came up with this idea, or who understood the science of the brain to say, yeah, look, you can dual code, it gives you a double chance of encoding that knowledge. But hopefully some of those were familiar to you and you would have been able to recall some of that. So probably today's session fits best with William at the bottom there, because Dylan William is a name that we would associate with all things to do with assessment, alongside many others, of course. And that's what today's session is very much about. And I've called it responsive teaching because I think this is a term we should be using almost to replace, but really it's an umbrella term for all of the things below. This idea of sort of assessment, feedback, checking understanding, the weekly, monthly reviews, all of that can be understood as responsive teaching. And Dylan William actually has said himself he wished he'd have used the term responsive teaching rather than the term assessment for learning when it was originally all sort of proposed, because it was misappropriated, it'd been misinterpreted, and it led to all sorts of things that actually he never intended. Actually, what he thought it should be about is responding. You find out what your students know and what they can do, and you respond to that. And that's exactly what we need to be doing in our classrooms. That hasn't changed. So I'm kind of using that term responsive teaching as an overarching term. But really, it's as simple as that. Learning, finding out through activities, through your questioning, through your retrieval tasks, what your students know and how well they can apply it, and then responding to it. And the responding bit is the really important bit. So this is sort of where it fits in. Now, we haven't got it as a standalone category, if you like, or component on our lesson ingredients, because it's not standalone. It's integral to everything. So when you're doing your retrieval tasks, you're formatively assessing, you're finding out what your students know, where their gaps are, what the misconceptions are. The better designed your retrieval task, the better you'll be able to do that. Every time you use any of the mechanisms that we've talked a lot about in terms of checking understanding, the cold calling, the ABC questioning, the mini whiteboard tasks, you are formatively assessing, you're finding out what your students know. And of course, when we're providing waggles, checklists, excellence criteria, what we're doing is we're saying to the students, and this is what you should know, and this is what you need to be able to know, and how you need to be able to apply it. So essentially, we're sharing our assessment objectives, but we move away from that kind of confusing language. But it's integral to everything that we do in the classroom, of course. So I hate the way you have to keep moving yourself on this. Anyway, first thing I want to talk about is hinge points. So we're familiar with the term hinge cards because the students have got them in the planners. They're those little cards, A to E, I think it is, which allows you to ask questions, probably multiple choice style questions where you say, hold up for A, hold up for B, and so on. Well, those are really useful because they allow you to use that idea of a hinge question. But what we mean by a hinge question is not just any old question. We need to think about those points in a sequence of lessons, or sometimes in one lesson, which are absolutely pivotal. It's a hinge point, because if their knowledge that they need in order to access this new learning that you're about to give them is secure, then that's fine, they go that way. But you've got to check it's secure, because if it isn't, and you try and plow on with your next bit of knowledge, and they haven't secured that previous necessary learning, then they go this way here. And that's going to lead to confusion, misconceptions, probably cognitive overload, because they're still trying to process what was before, and therefore frustration, poor behavior, goodness knows what else that we might experience when we try and plow on and the students are not ready. So we have to identify what the hinge points in our sequence of learning are, and then devise ways of checking so we know, is it safe to move on or is it not? So I just kind of did a worked example. So this is something I've been working with my year 12s on. This is their kind of current sequence of learning, if you like. And they have to, actually going way back, this idea here, this behavioural principle of classical conditioning, that was done at the beginning of year 12 when we introduced the approaches in psychology. But in my mind, I've got that bigger picture, and I always share that with the students. And I know they have to have had a good grasp of that, really secure, to then be able to apply the behavioural explanation to the issue of phobias, which is what we're doing now, and then be able to apply that and that understanding of what the behavioural approach says causes phobias, in order to understand how we should treat them from the behavioural perspective. So I know how it all pieces together. And so what I do is I identify what my hinge points are. And I have to think about whether those things are in their long-term memory and secure before I can plow on. So have they understood and secured the assumptions of the behavioural approach, the principles of classical conditioning, the language of classical conditioning, because I'm going to be using it, they need to be using it. Are they secure in that? Because we can't go ploughing on and applying it into a different context if they're not, and a particular case study that they have to know about and be really secure in. So I identify my hinge points. And then let's imagine I'm preparing this lesson here, the one with the circle. So I'm preparing a lesson on the behavioural treatments for phobias. In my mind, in my planning, I'm aware of all of the previous bits of knowledge that have to have fed into that. And it comes from all directions. You can see I've got this sort of linear from the behavioural approach, explaining, treating, but actually coming in from a different direction. I know they've also done some learning on how we characterise and diagnose phobias, and they've got to be secure in that. Otherwise, this is all just going to get really muddled. So in my mind, when I'm planning that lesson, I have to think about what are all the different points of knowledge they absolutely have to be securing, because I'm just going to have to go back and check that first. So what does it actually look like in the classroom, or really in your planning stage before you get into the classroom? Well, you need to think about what are those hinge points? What are the things that they need to have been securing before you can introduce this new idea, this new concept? And then you turn that into activities or questions that you know you're just going to need to check, formatively assess in your lesson. So I might, in that particular lesson, do a quick mini whiteboard, show me, tell me on the language of classical conditioning, just to check they know the neutral stimulus from their unconditioned response. Yeah. I might do a multiple choice quiz, and it might only be 3 or 5 questions on the main assumptions of the behavioural approach. I might do a hinge card activity with the options A to E, just a series of questions maybe around the characteristics of phobias. And I could do, and this would be nice as I'm circulating the room, a quick, right, okay, case of little Albert's going to be really important for us. Talk for a minute, talk for 1 minute on the case of little Albert, and I'm coming round and I'm listening in. Now, none of that is worth doing if I'm not going to take in the information that it gives me and do something with it. So I think that little arrow turning round there is really important. If I spot that they're not secure in a particular aspect of that previous learning that I know is pivotal to them being able to cope with the new bit, I mustn't be afraid to go back. I've got to go back. And I know we have all these pressures of like, but I've got to get through this. And I planned that we're moving on today, so we need to move on today, but it's pointless. So you mustn't be afraid to go back and review. And it's unlikely you're going to have to go back and review everything, but that's the beauty of having the right number of hinge questions or hinge points in the right, broken down, so that allows you to say, okay, that bit they're secure on, but that bit they're not, so we need to revisit that before we can plow on. And that's where your expertise in your subject and in your planning comes into its own, because a non-specialist wouldn't have a clue what your hinge points and what your hinge questions should therefore be. So I think that's absolutely critical to this idea of how we formatively assess. There's loads of different ways we can do it, isn't there? Creative ways, the ways we can question, the ways we can give them activities and tasks to check their understanding, but make sure you're checking the right understanding and that that's planned out. So apologies, because I know this is something that you've probably heard lots and lots of times, but I thought it would be really silly to continue on and use terms like formative assessment if there's anybody in the audience that isn't clear on the distinction. And I know most of you will be fully aware of this. So I've used Bloom's distinction actually, but there's lots of distinctions. Dylan William and so on have made other, the same distinction, just in different words. So when we're talking about summative assessment, essentially for us in our school context, we're talking about your end of teaching block assessments, your end of year exams, and of course your GCSEs, A levels. So it's that any summative assessment is employed to assess what the learners have achieved at the end of it all. So at the end of this teaching block, what do you know, what can you do? The formative assessment is the bit that this session's all about, because that's the bit that allows us to have responsive teaching. And that's the bit that provides feedback and correctives. I like that word, that we're spotting something and we're able to correct it before it goes any further at each stage of the teaching learning process. And linked to that distinction and the fact that the bit that we really want to reclaim as teachers is the formative assessment, is the bit at the bottom, that quote at the bottom from an education-based evidence review. We need to reclaim it and basically make it the servant of our business, of the curriculum, of pedagogy, so that it works for learning. It shows me, oh, I need to reteach that. I need to do that differently. They didn't get that. I wonder if dual coding could help. That explanation clearly wasn't clear because 80% of the class have got confused. I wonder if I can do that differently. Like, we're using assessment for our essentially improving our teaching, which is obviously to the gain of the students. So we're scrapping this term assessment for learning, not because it's not, because it is. We're assessing in order to improve learning, but it's just got too many negative associations. So we're going with responsive teaching. But if we look back at that sort of original assessment for learning almost framework and the ideas that Dylan William put forward, there are some things that we need to keep, whatever we might call it, whatever umbrella term we might use, we need to keep a lot of elements. But there's other things that through the years have, become distractions and confused, and we need to get rid of them. In fact, I think we pretty much have got rid of them. So this is really just a little bit of a summary and a reminder. So, gone are the days when we would expect students to write out learning intentions. What a waste of time. And also the amount of time that teachers spent agonizing over them, the language of them. It's important for the teacher and the student to know what knowledge the students must have by the end of that lesson or by the end of that series of lessons. That's the important bit. Peer and self-assessment, great, we should keep it. It's important when the students are ready, and they have to be ready, they have to be trained, they have to have seen it modelled lots of times, and they're going to need it scaffolding. We need to make sure that we're not falling into that time-wasting trap of getting students to mark each other's work when all that's really going to come from it is they write, oh, nice presentation, like the way you did that. when really nobody's gaining from that. But if done well, it can be really powerful, and it's not easy. All of the kind of trying to capture, we did a mini test, who got what mark, where am I going to record it, what does this mean, all of that analysis, that data, that's just not necessary. It's what you as the teacher have learned and what you're going to do that matters, not whether it's written in the mark book. And the same with attempting to kind of prove or evidence where formative assessment's taken place, the verbal feedback stamp and all of that. We know as a school we've totally moved away from that. And I think it's also really important that we don't see assessment for learning or formative assessment as a tick box. Oh, I did a mini whiteboard activity, I formatively assessed, tick. It's got to be about how we respond to it and react to it. The level descriptors, the grade descriptors that we went through that phase of when we kind of did our whole flight path thing, which was awful, and we were trying to say what grade a student was. Using those level descriptors, the principal was right. We need them to see what they ought to know and what they ought to be able to do. We don't need to assign a grade or a level to that. And that's where our excellence criteria, our waggles, our live marking, our showing them, excellence examples, talking to them about where this piece of knowledge fits into the bigger piece of knowledge and therefore why it's so important that they grasp this. That's the bit that they need. And that will also help them to do self and peer assessment as well when they're ready for that. So there's a lot of bits we need to lose that were never intended in the first place, but there's certainly some really key elements that we need to keep. And that's the important bit. So moving on to really just hopefully sharing some practical strategies and ideas. And most of these have been stolen, picked up from other people, books I've read, blogs, etc. But I've kind of taken, if you like, I've taken this box here and used it almost as a checklist. So if we think about this, the importance of formative assessment, we can't lose that checking of understanding. And this is really just a reminder. We know we check understanding in lots of different ways through our questioning, cold calling, mini whiteboard tasks, hinge cards, multiple choice questions. We do it all the time, not always just in retrieval, just all the time. A couple of things that I've linked to the questioning though, I've read quite a bit recently, it keeps coming up, the importance of wait time, pause time. So we ask questions, we shouldn't then expect to go straight to a student and get an answer. If we do, we're probably not going to get the same quality of answer. So let's tell them very clearly and be really explicit to them, I'm going to give you this minute, 2 minutes even, it will feel like it forever, to really think about this, because whoever I then pick to give me a response, I expect it to use key terminology. I expect it to be in a full sentence response, well justified, well reasoned. Over to you. So I think that idea of having a real high expectation in terms of their answer, but also in terms of the giving them time to construct that, because nobody can do it just put on the spot. And then moving on to self and peer assessment, and I said before, I'm just going to turn the light on. That's better. I said before that, our students would need training, they would need modelling, they would need scaffolding. And I think your students best as to whether or not they're ready for self and peer assessment. They have to be knowledgeable. Remember, you are still the expert in the room. We're not passing that responsibility over to students, but there can be a lot to be gained from it, because it helps them to become self-regulated learners, and it helps them to evaluate as they're writing. The more they can get into that thinking of what you're looking for when you're marking a piece of work. But I picked up on this, and I think it was from the Every Lesson Counts, Make Every Lesson Count series, of some sentence starters basically. And what you would say to students is, when you're marking your partner's work and you're reviewing this piece that they've just done, I want you to give me at least three, or give them at least three pieces of feedback, something kind, something specific, and something helpful. But of course, you could get some rubbish feedback from that. So you need to give them some almost sentence starters. So excellent use of. unless they put excellent use of pen, they're not going to end up with something really trivial and nonsensical with that. They're going to have to think about excellent use of quotes, excellent use of the formula here. Like they have to, that means they're getting a better quality. And the same with the specific. You're really guiding them towards what good feedback looks like. So that's just a few sentence starters that you might be able to make use of if you're doing peer or self-assessment. Then we move on and we've got this idea of the importance of students knowing what they're expected to learn. So we're not expecting them to write out learning intentions. We're not expecting the teacher to laboriously go through the learning intentions. But there's lots of things we can do to make sure they know what it is they've got to learn and know by the end of that lesson or series of lessons. So we can do learning journeys or maps. We can do checklists. We might choose to use a big question that, we say to them, this is the question, but that by the end of this series of lessons, you're going to be able to answer because you're going to have all of the necessary knowledge and know how to apply it. Of course, our knowledge organisers help with this, so effective use of the knowledge organisers and showing them that jigsaw, if you like, that zooming in, zooming out, where does that knowledge fit into the bigger picture? That is allowing them to become more reflective and self-assessing because they know what they're meant to know, and it allows them to kind of check, do I know that, or do I not? So the more of that we can do and share with them, the better. Okay, so I think it's important. I've sort of said I'm using this overarching term of responsive teaching, which is that encapsulates what it's all about, really. But I've talked so far up until this point about assessment, things we can do to formatively assess our students. Feedback is the response to that. So, we know we don't do formal written comments. We know we don't mark in the traditional sense, but we do provide feedback all the time in lots of different ways. Well, how do the two things fit together? What's the link here? Well, we know that formative assessment is any measure that we're using in the classroom to find out what they know and what they understand. And then we respond to that. Of course we do. We find out they don't know something. We reteach it. We address it. We correct them, or we ask them to correct themselves. So we're providing feedback all the time. And remember, feedback can be from us, but it can also be from their themselves, from their peers, actually from their experience. And that's the point at which you get them used to their self-regulation, that they're thinking, the last time I did that didn't work, so I'm not going to do it like that. Now that's the goal. We want students who can be kind of metacognitive and self-regulate, and we would still call that feedback. They're feeding back to themselves based on their previous experience. So, thinking about feedback specifically, and most of these ideas and thoughts I've got from a book by Michael Chiles, I think is how you pronounce his name, I'm not sure. This Craft of Assessment book, which is excellent. It's really short read, lots of ideas in it. About not just assessment actually, but all the things that feed up to that, such as retrieval and so on. So it's really useful. And in that, he identifies the difference between effective feedback and ineffective, which I'm sure is something we've all seen or thought about before. And of course, if it's really vague and unhelpful, like add more detail or write more, that's, of course, it's going to be ineffective. Nobody could respond well to that. Whereas if it's really granular, specific, and tells them what they need to do differently next time, then that is going to be effective. And that idea of it being actually more feed forward than feedback is exactly that. You're feeding back on a piece of work, but you're giving them the steps, you're giving them something to work on the next time they do that task or a similar task. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve the student, not that task. In a way, that task is gone. It's history. The student's going to have other things that they're working on, other opportunities, and we've got to improve the skill or the knowledge in them. And so I quite like this idea that he shared in his book of a knowledge review, where you get them to review what knowledge, so they could rag rate it, or it could be a tick list of how confident they are. You get them to review their knowledge, and then they identify the next steps. So if they were doing it as self-assessment, they would RAG rate it and then identify their next steps. If you were using something like this when you were marking a piece of work or feeding back, you would identify where their red areas are and therefore what their next steps should be. So I quite liked that idea, and you could play around with that. You could really, change the way you worked with it, but it's the principle. But of course, for any of that to work, you've got to then, within a reasonable amount of time, provide the students an opportunity to put it into practice. So when you're planning your feedback, whole class feedback, reteaching a particular element that clearly they haven't got, you've got to then plan in an opportunity for them to do another task that's different, but that allows them to put that into practice. Because if they don't actually practice what they've just learnt or what they've been told to work on, there isn't that rehearsal, there isn't that independent practice, and it won't be embedded. So I think that's really useful to think about in terms of planning out a sequence as well when we're providing feedback. So then obviously another important element of feedback is that we do want to obviously review the quality of the work in books. And we know we use whole class feedback, and we know that there's different strategies that you can employ there. I came across this, which I quite liked. It was the idea of a speeding violation, and the idea that if a student is, it's not about not having the knowledge, but if they've rushed a piece of work and the presentation is shabby and there's poor spelling and grammar and all of those other things, you would just literally, it's a time-saving device for teachers really, you would just literally have some of these slips printed out and just stick that in, and it's just pointing them to what you are not willing to accept, sloppiness basically. So I quite liked that. But also I like this idea as a strategy. So when you're sat with a series of your set of books, class set of books, not to mark, but to review and to therefore be able to respond to and feedback. Just this idea of having 3 piles, or it could be 3 lists of names on a piece of paper, those who really got it and need further challenge, those who need more practice, and those who have clearly got a shared misconception and it needs reteaching to. And so you're jotting down your names, and they're your groups for your feedback lesson, for your next lesson, or when you're going to be giving the books back to them and expecting students to do something with the feedback, they become your group. So it's this idea of having a fluid seating plan, but one that's very much about learning and what the different learners need to be doing. I know that Dawn, sorry to name you, Dawn, but I know that Dawn uses this strategy, and I've seen it in action where she'll pull a group of students to one side to do some more practice on something because from her review of their books, she knew they needed it. And I just think that's really effective and very, very, very powerful. And then, of course, there's live marking. Now, I know I'm going to say here, use your visualizer, and I know not all of you have visualizers, although Claire Atkinson did share a nice little app that allows you to use your phone as a visualizer, but, not everyone would be comfortable having their mobile phone out in lesson and all the rest of it. So I know there are some barriers, but we can get around the classroom and we can live mark. And these are just a few things picking up from that really. That if you're spotting, when you're looking at a piece of work in the lesson, you're spotting that the students made a mistake, or that, there's something missing or it's not quite right, highlighting, not just putting a little box around, but just give them a bit of time to think first why you might have done it before you reveal. Now, remember, you're the expert. We're not letting the students do it themselves here, but bit of think time, put the onus onto them. Why do you think I've highlighted that? What do you think's wrong with that? How could that be improved? And then they improve it there and then. So it's immediate feedback. It's intervention, really. It's intervening there and then, isn't it? Which is great. But don't do it all for them. Don't do all the hard work, because we're trying to train them up to be self-regulated and expect the students to think for themselves. If you've just done some live modelling under the visualizer, you've picked a student's work, put it under the visualizer, live marked it in front of everybody to say, oh, this was excellent, look what they've done there, oh, I think this could be developed more. And you've just done that to the whole class. And then it's right, okay, back to you, carry on with your improvements. And the hand goes up. What do I need to do to improve mine? No, you've just modelled it. They might need some extra scaffolding. They might need a prompt of some sort, but really push the students to think, well, what did I just do on the board? I'll put it back up there for you. What did I just do? So therefore, look at yours. What do you need to do? Because it's too easy for them to expect you to do all the hard work, and they have to actually put it into practice. And another nice idea, again, great if you've got a visualizer, but there'll be other ways around it if you haven't. When you're about to set the students off on another task, put under the visualizer some feedback of a student's work from the last task and re-narrate it for them. Pick it out. Do you see what we said needed to be done differently there? Do you see why that was so effective? Right, let's keep that in our minds as we now move on and do this next question or this next task. So the more you can do that, the more you can show students what you're looking for, what's good practice constantly. Like if you have got a visualizer in your classroom, or you can borrow one or have use of one, like make it routine. At least once a lesson, grab a student's work and flush it under there and do a bit of live marking or celebrate something that they've done well. Make it routine. The students will come to expect it, which will mean that sort of embarrassment of their work being under there will just go. They'll just get used to it. You'll get used to it, and you'll start to see what a fantastic strategy it is. So but if you haven't got a visualizer, you can still do it. You can read a student's work out. You can, have, for a future lesson, you can have photographed a piece of work and scanned it in, and had it on your PowerPoint. Like there are other ways. Okay, and then this is a final thought, and it is really just a thought. I think the more feedback we can give, the better, all the time. We're feeding back on the strategies that they use to do something, the knowledge, all the time feedback. It's going to lead to better learners. But I read something in, it was the book by Didow and Rose about what every teacher should know about psychology. I figured a psychology teacher should probably read that book. And they suggested that we should view feedback, live feedback, during a task as scaffolding that needs to gradually be removed. So imagine you've got your class and they're all working on something, and you're going round and you see a student doing something, and you step in and you point out to them, okay, there's a bit of an error going on there. Why do you think that is? How can we correct that? You might put it under the visualizer and show it to everybody so everybody can benefit from that feedback. Well, Didow and Rose suggest that that's great, but we should see that as something that we gradually remove, because what we're trying to do is create learners that do that for themselves. That becomes internalized. They don't need your voice for that. And that's this whole idea of them becoming metacognitive. And I've showed you this metacognition cycle before. So they've assessed the task before they've begun. And then as they're working on the task, they're assessing the strengths and the weaknesses, and they're reflecting. Now, I totally get what they're saying there. I wanted to share it with you so that you could have a think about it. What are your thoughts on that? My concern with it is a little bit that the teacher is still the expert, and we always should be providing students with that expertise rather than expecting them to come up with it themselves. But I also think it is important that we encourage them to think for themselves, and we're not doing it all for them. They've got to get to a point where they can spot their own mistakes if they're mistakes that have been pointed out to them before. So I guess it's about that building up, and getting them ready for it, holding their hand at first. So that is the end of my session. Hopefully you picked up a few ideas and strategies that you can use in your classroom, or at least got you thinking about, the difference between formative assessment, summative assessment, where does feedback come into it, what's responsive teaching. So hopefully, if nothing else, it's introduced you to a bit, or reintroduced you to some of that vocabulary. Okay, take care. Bye.